Friends, welcome to part 2 of the super comprehensive series I started last week with my friend Laura about the Chaga fungus. Friendly warning and spoiler alert, there is more information packed together in one place about the Chaga fungus than any other place I've seen on the internet. So snuggle up, buttercup, get comfy, grab yourself a cup of coffee, or better, a cup of Chaga tea, and maybe a pencil, and let's get into part 2. But just before we do, I want to give you a quick preview of last week's video, because if you missed it, you really should go back and watch that one before you watch this one. Sustainable harvesting of chaga is the basis of everything we're going to be talking about today in our long conversation, and that's what part 1 was all about. Laura and I get out into the wilds of the Canadian forest to do some harvesting.
I'm Laura from Wild Muskoka.
And together, we're not only going to show you a ton of live chaga in its natural habitat, we're going to snowshoe down that frozen lake. We're going to show you a frickin' ice waterfall and some of the wonders of the Canadian wilderness. We're also going to teach you a ton of stuff about the chaga fungus.
And this is a great way to sort of non-destructively find out if you're in the right stuff, and if it is indeed chaga. So Laura just spotted a really nice specimen up here, and I just saw one here.
Including a few different methods for the safe and sustainable harvest of the chaga fungus, and our thoughts on why we advocate for those methods.
Look at that nice little piece. You fell in the lake.
I fell through the lake at some point.
Who's this jabroni to be talking about the chaga fungus to me? What does he know? I study it, I teach classes on it, I write about it. So I think I'm probably a guy whose video that's all about the chaga fungus you would want to watch. There you go.
So definitely check out part 1. And hey, look at that. We're at my house now.
Yeah.
Like magic. Last time you saw us, we were in Laura's kitchen. It's a couple of weeks later, and Laura's down in my neck of the woods. And now, as promised, we're going to get right into a whole bunch of really interesting and valuable information about the chaga fungus. Laura, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Cold enough out there for you?
Oh, I love a proper Canadian winter. There's nothing like it.
It feels like the first real Canadian winter we've had in 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? And crazy snow too, crazy snowstorm. Did you see my driveway on the way in? Mm-hmm. I've got walls this high up the entire side of my driveway. It's been coming down.
Yeah.
Good chaga hunting weather.
It is.
Without further ado, let's sort of get into it. So you saw us harvest some chaga. We talked a little bit about a couple of different ways of doing that the right way, sustainably. But now I think what I would like to do to start out anyway, if you're down for it, Laura, is just to talk a little bit about the life cycle of this fungus, how it works out in nature, its role in nature maybe, and why it's kind of so precious and rare in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something that I've seen in a number of other videos, on this platform, where people are talking about chaga, and there's a lot of misunderstood information about it. Some people have been talking about it as being a beneficial organism for the tree.
It's a parasite.
Yeah. So my first introduction to it was actually through forest pathogens class.
Well, that tells you everything you need to know right there.
Yeah, as a parasite to the tree.
Yeah.
But something that I always like to make sure I judge is that our language inherently puts a negative term on something we call parasite. When we hear parasite, we tend to cringe. We tend to immediately think that this means it's bad.
Parasites are very important in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in the forest, they serve a really important role of kind of thinning trees. Yeah. And then a dead tree, it actually has more living cells than a living tree. Dead trees.
Yeah, there's so many other organisms that come and colonize it, right?
Yes, that support so many other species from fungal species to bacteria, all the way up the food chain to insects, and then all of birds and mammals. Yeah. And so we just have to remember, and again, for the forest soil itself, so that those later successional species in the forest can survive. So it's first things first, I'm always parasite doesn't equal bad. It's just
that's a super important point.
Term of function.
Yeah.
But the other parts about chaga people don't understand, because it is the sclerata. So unlike all these other mushroom species that people are harvesting, which is typically the fruiting body, so for harvesting reishi, for harvesting shiitakes, from logs, that's a fruiting body.
Yeah, or even other functional mushrooms, like you mentioned, reishi or hericiums or whatever, that's a fruit body. That's not what the chaga
when
fungus
I harvest reishi, I can harvest those fruiting bodies, and as I walk through the forest with my open basket, the spores are dropping around the forest.
Right.
You know, so there's like the act of foraging those mushrooms in some ways can actually help to spread them.
Be really beneficial. I teach it that way in my classes.
Yeah.
It's like always have a basket or a mesh bag.
Yeah.
Because you're doing this forest a favor by carrying those fruit bodies around.
Totally. And so all these other mushroom species that we talk about, we can actually apply those same principles, but chaga is very, very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
In its reproductive habits.
Absolutely. And so that's the first thing for people to understand is that when we're harvesting that sclerata, that is not the reproductive part.
At all.
It actually, unlike many other fungal species that reproduce annually, reproduce every few years, you know, even things like a number of the other Ganodermas, like they might reproduce for artist conch and stuff. Like they'll actually drop spores from the same fruiting body every year.
Yeah, prolifically.
Yeah. But chaga, it actually has to, because it's a parasite, it infects often a damaged piece of the tree. So the places that I've most commonly seen where it kind of like that sclerotic will grow, where it shows it was infected, was from like where a branch gets ripped off the tree, or there's been some sort of injury to the bark.
I think the vast majority of colonization of that substrate is via a wound.
A wound.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the wound is there, and then this like white rot develops inside the tree as like the mycelium.
It's a white rot fungus for those of you who aren't familiar. And that's its like job in nature.
A forestry term. And then it will grow on the tree. If it's a white birch, I find it tends to be, you know, a little less, but yellow birch being just a harder tree, it can grow for sometimes decades on those trees before the tree dies. And I don't like to make the assumption that it's the chaga that kills the tree. It's just that it was probably a factor, but there's lots of other factors of why that tree. So
it sped it along.
Speds, you know, increases the chance. But like to say, it's not necessarily true to always say that the chaga killed the tree. But
I think that's fair.
It was a factor.
Yeah.
But what has to happen for the chaga to reproduce is the birch tree has to die.
All over.
Not even, or standing is actually more.
It's better.
More common.
They generally do, but whatever.
Yeah. So the tree needs to die, and then it takes between it hasn't actually been studied very much because it's not super common to find it in its reproductive stage, but the estimate is it takes between 2 and 12 years of the tree to be dead. And then what happens is that internal white rot has spread enough through the tree. It's actually been found to be better if the tree didn't fall over, because if the tree falls to the ground, the chance that other fungal species
colonize
and overtake the chaga mycelium increases. So if the tree happens to stay standing,
it is better.
Better for its reproduction. It's just less competition.
Well, also the spores are higher up too for dispersal later.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it will take 2 to 12 years for the tree to essentially rot to a very particular point and under very particular conditions. What'll happen is this. It's called a respondate layer, and I've seen it once. I was actually really lucky to be in the forest.
She sent me a video of it. It was amazing.
So to see it, and what it basically is, it's this very thin respondent layer of basidispores, and so it forms not from the sclerata. It forms on the sapwood of the tree.
And it's like a gelatinous layer on the outside.
It's very thin, yeah. So it basically follows the pathway of whatever was the most, of the sapwood. So it's immediately under the bark. And it's a very thin gelatinous layer. And then it under pressure, it sends out these little tendrils to the bark, and it splits the bark vertically. Which, if you find dead birch in the forest, you don't find the bark splits vertically very easily.
Yeah, not very often. Yeah, wouldn't see that typically.
It splits horizontally, like in rotten logs.
Yeah.
And so to see something under pressure where it has split vertically is quite unusual. And that was actually the first piece that caught my eye.
That's probably what caught your eye. Yeah,
what caught my eye that is an unusual way to see the bark split. And then when I looked closely, there was actually a piece of log on the ground, and then there was a very large standing dead portion.
Yeah.
And this thin gelatinous respondent layer was actually releasing spores. And then upon further study,
It's so amazing you got to see it.
Yeah, it's so cool.
I've seen it dried out after that happened. I've never been lucky like that to find the moment where literally Laura sent me a video of spores in the air from this process that takes decades and decades and decades. It's the culmination. Think about how long that takes.
Yeah.
I've seen specimens over 100 years old, where like papers on specimens over 100 years old. I think the average would be 40 to 80 years.
Yeah.
And for most specimens to actually get to the point where they've killed the tree or the tree dies.
Yeah.
And actually gets to that reproductive process. So the fact, like, it was like needle in a haystack, lightning in a bottle, that you got to see that exact culmination of that moment.
Yeah, like, it was so fun to find in some fungal papers where they're saying it's like the holy grail of like mycology to find it.
Yeah.
And
go try and Google it if you want to. Like, you'll find very little information on the subject and way less photographs, and certainly not video. It's actually like a rare find. I'm gonna hopefully get
Laura we'll splice it in.
I'll drop it in for you so you can see it. But it's really fascinating and a really rare moment. I'm still glad you got to see it.
And upon witness, and it was interesting to even look into it and find out that it had been studied once or twice, and one of the things was like, there's a particular type of beetle that will come and lay its larvae in that resplendent layer, because all funguses have different, especially like, and they are how they disperse. So there's I mean, if you hunt boletes, you know this.
Yeah, sure.
How many, like, or, you know, oyster mushrooms, like how many larvae of organisms will be in fungi.
Sure.
And some of them are many host specific, like only that species of fungi will be able to host that certain beetle. And so there's a particular beetle.
There's tons of symbiosis out in the forest that goes on like that we're just beginning to understand.
That beetle larvae, you know, grows very quickly before that layer dries out, and then it's one of the major spore dispersal methods.
Yeah, the things that will crawl around and sprout.
Fly around the forest, and then they spread those spores. And since finding it, I have now developing that search image, particularly for the way that the bark splits, and having seen that layer, I can now see how it dries out. And so I've actually since found it twice out in the forest, and it's a good reminder to me and it's a neat thing to try to learn to develop a search image for, because it can also be a factor in your determination of, is this even a good place for me to harvest? Because if you can find one of those trees that's dried out that shows that it had reproduced, you're like, great. It is in a, like, there's
I'm on the trail. Hot on the trail. Yeah.
And there's enough chaga in this environment to show that it's reproducing.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. So that's a great place to start. Just in that, the point that I want to make and really make clear on this video is that every single time that you set out to harvest the chaga fungus, keep this portion of it in mind. This fungus, this miracle of nature in a lot of ways, is an extremely slow reproducer. It takes decades and decades and decades for us to get a harvestable size conch. So only ever take what you need for yourself and your family and your friends, for example, and leave some behind on the tree, because this is a fungus that can also regenerate, okay, over time, if you let it and you leave enough on there. Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
About how, I think...
Well, just about regeneration, maybe, and also if you have any points to add, maybe just on the sustainable harvest of it and why it's so important for us to take only what we need. Let me just real quick drop in a stat here. I was interviewed by a journalist for a publication called Modern Farmer last year, who had done a whole year of research on the commercial aspects of chaga, because it's becoming so wildly popular. It's sort of the darling of the health, food, and wellness space these days, right? As a lot of different functional or medicinal mushrooms are. Do you know there's over 1 billion pounds of this stuff being harvested and sold commercially every single year, annually? So, like, try and conceptualize, first of all, what 1 billion of anything is, right? It's hard to do, and I'm really sorry if I just put an image of, like, Elon Musk in your head. Really sorry about that. But, like, 1 billion pounds of this stuff is being sold, okay? So, the most sustainable way of doing it is obviously going out. So the most sustainable way, obviously, is going out and collecting and harvesting yourself in the amounts that you need and not more. But if you are buying it, try and buy it from a reputable source and be aware of the crazy long life cycle of this organism, how long it takes to mature, spore out, reproduce, and make more chaga. And what a rare commodity it actually is in nature.
Yeah, I mean, the fact, like, it has to grow where there's birch trees. And then on birch trees, it's only on, I mean, a study from the White Mountains, the really collaborative study that had done was, and it was on chaga harvest. It was like 3% of the birch trees
Yeah,
in the
maybe.
entire White Mountain Forest. And I was like, yeah, I feel like having walked hundreds and hundreds of
right, like we did the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, my path.
And that was a hot spot. There was a lot there.
I used to do ecological land surveys as part of my job, and so I did basically forest classification. So I've walked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of forest classifying, and it's like you can pass 100 birch trees and maybe 1 or 2 have them on it. You'll get into areas where there might be clusters of it. Again, just thinking because of the exposure.
Yeah.
But then you might, in that same forest, I might walk another few kilometers where you pass hundreds of trees that don't have it.
Yeah.
And so it's not very common in the environment.
And this is a really important story, Laura, to interject, but I forgot a really important point that this is a great time to bring it up, is that right now, all of the chaga that is out there being commercially sold is wild harvested.
Yes.
We don't have a cultivation method that's reliable or that could even meet a tiny fraction of the demand for chaga in its, sort of current popular state, right? So know that every chaga beverage you're drinking, every chaga tincture, every chaga product that you might go buy on the internet or something came from the wild and was growing in wild conditions. And that's like really, really important. There are some projects in Finland and other places where they're just beginning in the sort of nascent first steps of creating a chaga industry where they're able to farm it. But think about what it requires. We're talking about entire plantations of birch trees that might have a lifespan of 80 years that need to grow up and to be inoculated and for that fungus to grow and eventually reproduce again. So we're nowhere near, we're probably decades out, maybe not decades. I think there's one in Finland that's getting close to be able to meeting 0.01% of demand or something.
Claims, like there are some companies.
But it's a long way off. Yeah. It's all wild harvested. Keep that in your mind every time you buy it and you take it from the forest. Yeah, sorry to interject. I just really wanted to make that point.
Oh no, and it's a really important one. Just to and so if we're going to use chaga products, if we're going to harvest chaga, knowing that it's very potent medicine, so a very small amount of it really goes a long way.
You said that the other day, a little goes a long way. It's so true.
A little goes a long way. And then if you're going to buy extracts, making sure that they are very well extracted.
Efficiently,
that they've done it efficiently. And what has already been harvested, making sure that we're using it well. And so learning to make teas and knowing that you can rebrew it multiple times.
The one you're drinking right now has been going for 4 days.
Yeah. I mean, it has so many antibacterial properties in it. You could never do that with like nettle or peppermint.
It doesn't go bad.
It doesn't. No, it's all this natural antibacterial compounds that prevent it from going bad.
I'll tell you a funny anecdote just really quickly because people ask me all the time, like, what's the shelf life? And once I make a tea, do I have to put it in the fridge and all that? I mean, sure, maybe that's best practice, but I'll give you a funny story. So last summer, I made a pot of chaga tea. I don't consume it a ton in the summer, but I do have a degenerative polyarthritic condition, and sometimes I have little flare-ups, and I put myself on a little course of it. And we're going to talk about dosage and uses and all that stuff as this conversation goes on. But anyway, it was in the summertime. Heat, and this house is not air conditioned. Okay, so just note that. It gets really hot in here in the summer, even with all the windows cranked open and all the fans and everything, right? Well, I was in a really busy period of teaching my mushroom classes. I tour all over the province, giving lectures at universities and colleges and naturalist clubs, etc. And I left this thing on the stove. It wasn't even that potent. I think it was like a 7 or 6 day old thing that I'd taken a lot of stuff out of already. A lot of the goodness, a lot of those antibacterial properties. And then I took off and I was gone for like 7 days and I came back, didn't even notice it in the little pot on the back of my stove, went about my thing. I was here for a few days and then I had to take off again. And I was gone for another 5 or 6 days. Forgot again. Anyway, long story short, this thing sat on my stovetop for over a month. By the time I realized that it was there in the heat of the summer, right in the middle, and I was like, oh man, this sucks, man. I'm going to have to chuck this away. I take off the lid. It looks exactly like I left it there over a month ago in the middle of August. And then I take a little shot glass and I have a couple little sips. It tastes exactly the way I left it there over a month ago.
No fermentation at all.
Zero fermentation, zero sourness.
Don't necessarily recommend this at home.
No, I'm not saying do this. Yeah, I'm certainly not recommending that you do this, but I'm saying that the antimicrobial properties of this fungus are so strong that, again, not recommending that, great point, but it doesn't go bad. Like it just doesn't go bad, and the shelf life's incredible.
But it's important to know that
don't try that at home.
Yes, but one piece that I think sometimes around the harvesting and sustainability part again. So for one, you saw when we were harvesting the vita, we don't take the whole thing. Yeah. There's no need to take the whole thing. Little goes a long way. I've had over the more than decade that I feel like I've known about chaga, been around kind of like natural communities. Lots of people get excited and have shown me their harvests, and they're like, "Look at this giant chaga!" And I'm like, wow, there was no need to harvest. For one, that's probably like 5 years from then.
Yeah. But did you need 50 pounds in there? Yeah.
The thing that people don't understand, that I've seen many, many times, is because it's such a hard-growing organism, it's not fleshy. People don't realize that it actually has to be properly dried and preserved. And so that's one mistake that I have seen people make, is that they harvest it, and then I don't want to give, because it has these antibacterial compounds, don't think it won't go moldy.
Yeah, it does.
You have to, when you harvest it,
especially if it's not dried properly.
Exactly. So upon harvesting, when you harvest, you need to, I don't typically harvest large conchs because I just pick big little pieces.
You were saying,
they're pretty.
That's a good way of going about it.
But there is
if you're harvesting from specimens.
So we had someone once gifted me, because the tree was a large birch tree, it had a very big tree, and the tree was next to cottage, and so because the
was coming down.
Yeah, the tree needed to come down, and the presence of the chaga showed that it was going to potentially that's a sign of white rot in the tree, and so
it might fall on your cottage. Reasonable,
absolutely. So from a liability perspective, that tree needed to come down, and so there was no we were like, well, we might as well harvest the whole conch. Yeah. And so, but this person handed it to me, and it's like I can't just take this big piece and throw it in a jar and expect it to be fine. So you have to break it up into pieces so that. You break it up with I use a chisel and a hammer, and you have to break it up and you have to dry it. And so you don't necessarily, because most of the time when we're harvesting chaga, it's in the winter time. I know you'll speak to that. And so typically indoors, that is a time of year where the humidity is low. Yeah. And so, you don't have to get a fancy dehydrator and do those things. As long as you break it up and put it in an open, airy basket.
It takes a little longer. I put it by vent. By register on the floor.
Humidity. Yeah. I happen to live in a house with wood stove, so just great. I just chisel it up into chunks, this size, put it in an open basket, stick it on a shelf, and it'll dry just fine. But it is really important to know that even though it's antibacterial in nature, if you don't dry it properly, it will mold. And that's primordial. And it's a sad thing to think of when we've talked about how rare it is in the environment and its ecology and how slow it is.
To let it go bad,
to harvest some and then let it go bad is a pretty heartbreaking thing.
Absolutely.
And so just because it's hard growing, understand that it does still have to be properly dried.
100%. That's a great point. And there's something else that I want to really just quickly, just because you mentioned wood stove, just on caveats. So there was the great chaga fire of 2019 in this house that almost literally burned this place down, because chaga is an excellent, excellent tinder conch as well. So I would just want to add that if you are drying chaga near a wood stove or any open flame, and I have personal experience with this, literally almost burning down this very house because right by my fireplace, and I had it open, and one little stray spark hit it. Okay. It happened in front of me, and that's how small that spark was. I didn't even notice it, and it hit that chaga, which is an incredible accelerant, and literally trays of it were on fire on my carpet in seconds, like that. And I was running outside with bare hands, chucking these trays into the snow. So just be really, really careful around any open flame, a wood stove, a fireplace, etc. What I recommend is to chop it up into those little bits. Or a lot of times I'll just do planks if I'm in a rush. I'll cut big planks like you would with wood and hang them, or put them in a spot near a register, where there's some air blowing, etc.
Good air flowing.
You can dry them outside, not in direct sunlight, but anytime there's a little bit of wind, that's great. And I do have a fancy Boss dehydrator too with a whole bunch of trays. That's great, but you don't have to go and spend spend that money to do it. You can dehydrate any mushrooms just in your oven with the light on and the door cracked open a bit. And that's a great way of doing it for free.
Yeah. And mushrooms are the one I will actually put in the sun. Do you know about the vitamin D increase?
You can. Now with chaga, I don't think that's necessarily
chaga's not the same. But the other mushrooms you can totally.
With edible mushrooms, it's a great practice because you're upping that vitamin D quotient that's in there for sure. Chaga doesn't need it.
No.
Chaga, I wouldn't recommend sunlight, but every other mushroom, you absolutely could.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go. Why don't we go more into like preparation and use and stuff in a bit? Because there's some other ecological things I think we both want to hit, and maybe just talk about why we're even talking about it. Why do people care about this weird black fungus thing that's all the rage on the internet, right? Like, why are we sitting here discussing it? Well, it's because it does have a remarkable range of beneficial effects on our body that we have lots of hard science and data on from laboratories, etc. Now, in vivo human clinical studies are lacking for a lot of the claims you're going to see on the internet. So some of what I want to talk about today too is just debunking a lot of the nonsense and misinformation that's out there on the internet. As you might already know, I teach an entire class on this fungus, and so does Laura. And a lot of what we talk about in that class is the debunking of all these kind of, spurious claims in some cases about all the things that chaga fungus can and can't do. So maybe we should get into a little bit of that. Just talk about, you're an herbalist, what you recommend it for, what you use it for. Or maybe I can get into some of the nerdy science stuff and just talk about some of those compounds and how we know they affect different processes in our body, etc. I'll try and keep it short and as low nerd quotient as possible.
Yeah, and you get deep into it in your classes.
I get really, really deep into this stuff in my classes, and if you're curious in these subjects, I'd highly recommend come on out and spend an afternoon with me or with Laura in one of our classes where we can really do a deep dive on this stuff. But I want to touch on it at least so that you know what we're talking about and why we're sitting here talking about it or spending all this time harvesting in the first place.
Yeah.
So why don't I have some class notes here. I'm just going to really quickly have a quick look at some points in here, and I'm not going to be reading from this. I'm not going to literally do the class here. What I want to do is just make sure to hit a few points and not forget them.
Yeah.
So, I just mentioned, as it turns out, science and data are beginning to finally prove out what our Aboriginal ancestors all around the northern hemispheres of this planet have known for since before recorded history, that there really are a remarkable range of beneficial effects that you can get from this fungus when used appropriately and in moderation. All right. The biological activity stimulated by this fungus is not like too many other things I know of in nature. They call it the king of mushrooms, and I know you have problems with that term. I don't know if we need to get into that or not, but there's a reason that this mushroom is put up on a pedestal and venerated this way. Mm-hmm. It's packed full of antioxidants. It's one of the most antioxidant-rich foods that we've ever tested in the history of consumable goods.
Yeah, and that piece is specific to chaga. There's lots of these other
functional mushrooms.
Many functional mushrooms that can have a lot of the same kind of anti-inflammatory compounds and
especially when we're talking about antioxidants.
But antioxidant is one of the characteristics that make chaga kind of stand out amongst the functional mushrooms.
Well, it's just so high, the amount of antioxidants in them. Now, without nerding out too hard on this, let me just give you a quick comparison on the chaga fungus and, say, blueberries, which have long been touted as this amazing source of antioxidants, and they are. They're great. But, in the health food space for years and years, it was all about blueberries.
Yeah, dark fruits.
Dark fruits, etc., right? Anthocyanins. Again, sorry about, I'm going to try and avoid doing that. Because there's a whole rabbit hole to go down there as well. But just in a side-by-side comparison by a number of different methodologies of testing antioxidant value or the free radical fighting ability of antioxidant compounds in things that we know of that we can consume, the chaga fungus can contain, and I've seen papers on this from lab studies, over 40 times more antioxidants than a blueberry gram for gram.
Yeah.
Isn't that insane?
It is. And, I love these things where, there's the science, but then when we actually just work with the organism, so when we, make tea from chaga, what color is it?
Yeah, it's black.
It's like so dark. It's so black. So yes, there's all the science, and then when we actually like...
Well, there's physical signs of it too.
There's physical signs.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, and you don't get that color from any of the other mushrooms.
Yeah.
You know?
Have you ever made another mushroom tea that looked like that?
No.
It just doesn't happen. If you've never seen it, I'll drop in a photo right now. It's a beautiful, luxurious black color.
Black. Like, it looks like... It doesn't necessarily taste like coffee. I actually think it tastes better. Like, I can drink it straight. And I'm not a black coffee person, but I can...
I'm a coffee addict, so I'm not the guy to talk to. I don't think it's a coffee substitute at all, but people use it that way. It doesn't taste like it, but it's a pretty... It's a little... Anyway, we're going to get into coffee substitute is a problematic area for me.
Yeah.
Which we do need to talk about at some point, because you should not be drinking it in the quantities you drink coffee ever.
It's just so nice to see, like, when there's all the science talking about the antioxidant, and then you just make it, and you should be like, oh, right, look at how dark this is.
For sure, it's a great point.
So, yeah.
So now there's some debate in the scientific community, just to get back to like Nerd Zone, about the different methodologies used to test it. One of the most popular one, and the one that you're going to see on all the websites that sell chaga, is the ORAC scale. That's oxygen radical absorbency capacity, is what that stands for, ORAC. And it, without going too far into that part of it, which honestly is a little beyond my pay grade, there is some scientific debate about the efficacy of using that particular one that is cited over and over again, that you see in all the literature, etc. So let's just grant them that. Let's say maybe that wasn't the thing. Well, here's what we do know based on like a ton of other methodologies and that one, the ORAC scale. There's a ton of antioxidants in there. We don't have to debate that they're in there anymore.
Yeah.
We have a ton of lab science on this.
Yeah.
Right? So that part's good. It's packed full of antioxidants. And let me just hit a few others so I don't forget it. I'll read off this little page. So it's packed full of antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, along with many other chemical compounds, and have shown promising anecdotal results in a wide variety of uses with various illnesses and disorders. Now, we're not going to cover all of those, but I would like to talk about some where I know of the efficacy firsthand, my own particular condition. Maybe you could speak to some for some of the people that you prepare chaga tinctures for, or whatever your products you're making in your own community as an herbalist. And then I would like to spend a little time, and I hope you can help me with this too, debunking some of the claims that we hear about the chaga fungus that I know there's no science on, or not enough science on, and that I think is maybe leading some people astray, and hopefully not harming people, thinking they're healing themselves when they could be maybe taking other avenues to address those problems.
Sure.
Right?
Because nothing is a panacea.
Nothing is a panacea. Like, the chaga fungus isn't gonna fix your life, man. People sell the chaga fungus as the king of mushrooms, and as this great panacea, as this it's almost like the way snake oil was sold by these dudes in like covered wagons, back in the colonial what we call, like, in the Wild West, and we really are in the Wild West of medicinal or functional mushrooms right now. It's kind of an apt way of looking at it. Like, there isn't a lot of hard rules. There's a lot of science missing on this stuff.
Yeah, and just to address why is there, because there's been lots of what are called the in vitro.
In vitro, so lab studies.
Which is when cells have been studied with a compound in a petri dish.
Correct.
And there's been very few human trials. And it's just because people look, well, if there's been so much evidence of, really good therapeutic use in cells, why are there no human trials? But one thing, again, when we talk about sustainability, so those human trials are really, really expensive, for one. They tend to be funded by pharmaceutical companies. 100%. And so when we're dealing with wild-crafted substances...
And especially ones that you can harvest and make on your own. That's a threat.
Well, that's the thing. So those substances, because they're not drugs, they're living organisms, they can't be patented. And then two, because there isn't a viable cultivation method for them.
Correct.
There isn't the same level of human trials. Where some of the other functional mushrooms, things like cordyceps and lion's mane and reishi, there is more... We
have reliable ways of growing
cultivating them en masse.
Yes.
So there's much more investment from industry to want to pay for those human trials. So it's not for lack of therapeutic potential.
Or
it's
evidence.
Because the commercial potential, viability long term on a very large scale is very low. And so that's the driving force. It's not for potential. It's just because on a practical sense, there isn't the money to fund those studies when there isn't a way to mass produce these medicines. And so it's just an important piece to remember that, you know, when we don't have the industry to drive the research, it's not for the fact that there isn't potential. It's just that there isn't the potential to make money.
So all I would add to that is that because there's not that potential for, profit, there's not a profit motive, doesn't mean this stuff doesn't work either.
Oh no, that's why. Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of what I see a lot of this online with like so-called experts, and people that I really respect in the fields of like, say, identification of fungi or some of the other areas of research in fungi who will just like outright dismiss the efficacy of the chaga fungus or other functional mushrooms or medicinal mushrooms because we don't have in vivo trials. But here's what we do
human
have.
Trials.
Human trials. Those are in vivo human clinical trials. So in vivo is human trials. In vitro are laboratory studies. Because we don't have those, are just outright negating the properties that we know from like literally decades and decades of lab research. We know these compounds, we know about their biological effects on our bodies, and we can extrapolate the effects. Okay, now what we can't do effectively, and this is another reason why they can't be patented, etc. at this time or classified as drugs, is we can't know interactions with every single drug on the market, and that's very important. We're going to talk a little about some contraindications, etc. if you want to use the chaga fungus in your own health strategy down the road. So we don't know the contraindications, and we don't have guidelines on specific dosing. We don't have a lot of things that you get with a pharmaceutical drugs, and those are good things about those pharmaceutical drugs. The reliability, when we're talking about medicine, we want reliability and we want repeatability, and that's very hard to do with functional mushrooms.
Absolutely.
In a lot of ways. Now, I just want to double down on this point. That doesn't mean that the research that we have is worthless, or the thousands of years of anecdotal evidence from our Aboriginal ancestors, which I happen to put a lot of stock in. You know, like I feel like when Sally down the way tells me that she's taking the chaga fungus and she's having a positive effect on X, Y, or Z, I'm not discounting it immediately because she's not a scientist. Okay, I'm believing Sally's word that she is feeling better. Now, you might say placebo effect, you might say all kind of things, and some of that might even be true. But based on the science, and that's all I teach in my courses, is the way that we have studied these functional mushrooms and the chaga fungus specifically, that we know about the bioactive reactions that can happen to various processes within our body based on what these compounds are, and we can extrapolate a lot of good medicine and healing from that.
Yeah. And at the same
Would you
time,
agree? Like,
at the same time, we're not experts, and and we continue to evolve our.
Yeah, like Laura and I think there's. I feel very uncomfortable with that term. A lot of people call me a mushroom expert. I'm sure you've had that same thing. But what I find is like the more I learn, the more I know I don't know.
Yes.
And it's not a term I'm super comfortable with, although I'm sure like people like you and I, we know more about wild mushrooms and the chaga fungus than 99% of humans. But that doesn't make us experts. Like, I don't feel that way.
No.
Even though like I've spent decades researching this thing and I use it in my own life and all that stuff. And I've written countless articles about it in different publications and you name it. It's a strong word.
Yes.
Experts. So take everything, I guess, that we're saying here today with a grain of salt, and do your own reading and research on it. But know that you are talking to two very experienced foragers and people who have been working with this fungus for a long, long time. Yeah. That being said, let's get just back to this. So yeah, packed full of antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, and tons of other compounds. And there's a laundry list of compounds here that I could go through, but I'm not going to. We'll save that for the class if I ever see you out at a class or maybe one of Laura's classes. But all these compounds do provide a wide spectrum of biological activity. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the claims, some of the things we have science for, some of the things we don't have science for, so that people can sort of, do their own research, make up their own minds, etc. So, things that we have data on that I could show you white papers for, and I'm going to try to remember to link some descriptions. Link some papers down in the description here. The chaga fungus has been shown, and many other functional mushrooms have been shown to support and strengthen our immune system. Okay, that kind of goes without saying with all this antioxidant quantity and free radical fighting, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Provide powerful anti-inflammatory properties, antimicrobial properties. We have studies on the antiviral benefits and properties of the chaga fungus. We even have nascent studies, in very interesting recent studies on supporting heart health and gut health with the chaga fungus. And they can also promote good digestion and reduce inflammation in the intestinal tract. There's actually one really recent study from 2023 that I really just got through showing that, which is sort of like a new use that I actually kind of have heard about for a long time. And it's really promising to see that some of that research is finally getting done.
Yeah, and the bowel and gut inflammation.
Yeah, people with Crohn's.
Yeah.
Etc. Some of my favorite, and we were talking about this before we started rolling here, some of my favorite and sort of like the hook that got me into like the rabbit hole of researching the scientific study on the chaga fungus was a study from the 1950s that was done in Poland on psoriasis. I suffer from psoriatic arthritis, and that was the one that stuck out to me as something that might help me and got me sort of into like the really deep into the research phase of my journey with the chaga fungus.
Is psoriasis a autoimmune disorder?
It is. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So you can see with the all the autoimmune boosting properties of functional mushrooms, and especially the chaga fungus, how people are having success with it.
Yeah, that immune modulating effect.
Immunomodulation. Yeah, we should talk about the adaptogenic properties at some point too before, but I just want to talk to you just about some of these that I just mentioned here. Are you familiar with some of these, and have you ever given a product that you've made or recommended it to someone who's asked you for advice about a herbal remedy about any of those particular uses? Yeah,
I mean, for immune, the D-beta glucans that are in it.
Polysaccharides,
yeah. Oh, yeah. So which are the D-beta are type of the polysaccharide, which many of the other functional mushrooms have. That's correct. One of the where I'll use chaga in conjunction with a number of other medicinal mushrooms. And what's incredible is even how many of those also grow in birch.
Yeah.
Which is just
Isn't
like
it? Yeah, it's kind of
interesting factor of thinking the greater relationship that birch itself holds in those. But that term immune modulating is like one that I like to always like explain to people.
Yeah, explain it a little bit. Yeah.
Because
it's a very important concept.
It's not a action that is found in Western medicine. So our drugs that we use, so the pharmaceutical compounds that we typically have in our drugs have a very particular action of either like as a stimulant to, a metabolic function or a suppressant. And so something like psoriasis is like an autoimmune disorder that is from like an overactivity of the immune system.
The body attacking itself.
Yeah. But an immune modulating substance, which a number of the medicinal mushrooms are so incredible at, and as well as a number of other things like adaptogens, but that's another term. But immune modulating is essentially a substance that can allow the immune system, if it's overactive, to knock it down.
Yeah.
And then for people that are more immune compromised, that get sick all of the time, it boosts the immune system. And so it's something that in Western pharmaceutical medicine is almost unheard of, to have a substance.
And I think that's why a lot of people are skeptical of it.
They are, because they're like, how can a single substance be a stimulant or a suppressant?
Right.
But what it is that because these are organisms that our bodies evolved from, like we are as mammals, we are like much younger, and so our entire biology like evolved from the natural world and from these substances. So our immune system has the ability when we are presented these substances, our immune system can then just come back into balance. So immunomodulating just means it's going to be able to regulate, and that's one of the most powerful abilities of these D-beta-glucan polysaccharides that are in chaga in really high amounts, as well as a number of the other functional mushrooms.
Absolutely. So think of it like that powerful immunomodulation property of this fungus. Think of it almost like, the chaga fungus hopping in the driver's seat of your immune system for a minute, and telling it what it needs to do. Or maybe a better analogy might be like a guide for your immune system, or like your immune system is a little lost. Yeah, maybe a therapist for your immune system, or your immune system is in an unknown city and it's going, no, the post office is that way. Yeah. This is where you need to go to do the thing that you need to do. Yeah. And that immunomodulation might help you. That's a terrible example. Yeah, but I was just thinking off the top of my head, but you get the idea.
Yeah, but not through stimulation and not through suppression.
Neither one of those things. It's kind of, it's like guiding it in that direction.
It's a difficult thing for science to be able to explain how it functions.
Well, and again, like this is why I think so many people in the scientific community who haven't looked at it closely and in the medical profession, etc., are skeptical of these compounds, because it does seem to be almost kind of like a magical ability, but it does do that.
Yeah. And then often very tied again to the inflammatory action. So yeah, absolutely.
So without going too far into that, because that's a whole, again, big rabbit hole that we go into, just like the whole pharmaceutical aspect of it and the profit motives and all that stuff, which I don't want this video to really be about that so much. Yeah. I want you to be able to be gleaning information from two very knowledgeable people on this subject and use this in your own life. So we can have that talk at a seminar sometime or whatever. What I would like to do, though, is just talk a little bit more about, we mentioned the adaptogenic properties. Adaptogenic properties of anything in nature, and the chaga fungus is a particularly good one, help to control stress and reduce anxiety by lowering cortisol levels in our blood and brain. And if you're not familiar with that particular compound, cortisol is a chemical that's produced by our own bodies, by our adrenal glands. It's our body's main stress hormone, okay? And it can cause a host of physical and mental problems when too much of that cortisol is produced. And I won't go into that whole big long list now, but I want to just sort of point out that it's so easy to understand why so many people have had success in treating anxiety and depression with the chaga fungus, because it can help restore the proper balance of cortisol in our blood and brain and help us to overcome that anxiety.
Yeah, it's a piece. Adaptogens is a term for me personally that I use them.
Yes.
But there is, in our Western culture, again, we have this idea of like, if I just take this substance, then it's going to fix me.
Yeah.
And so as much as I work with adaptogens for those same, I tend to, I'll just, say chaga's great, but remembering that I tend to use them like in a community of organisms.
Sure.
And then
part of what you do as an herbalist is a host of things. It's not just one.
Remembering almost equally that your lifestyle changes can be a part of that adaptogenic result.
Absolutely.
And so it's really important to remember that we can't just continue to expose ourselves to the same stressors and then just
and chaga. Yeah, it's not going to work.
Some chaga tincture and then have it help.
Absolutely.
So yes, we can expose our body to those substances that can help us with those problems at the same time, as long as we're equally making some lifestyle changes.
100%.
And the incredible thing, even if we think about from a truly holistic approach to working with chaga, those stress-reducing anti-anxiety compounds might also come from the act of going out into the forest on these long walks to find the medicine and learning about the forest and taking and then harvesting it and working. Maybe hammering it to break it down, reducing some of the stress.
All of it counts.
And the act of making the tea and remembering that to not, because again, the criticism can be sure if you're just taking the tincture and you're not making any other changes, you're probably not going to have that. But if we use it in a truly holistic approach, the actual full act of harvesting and working with it might even be part of
the cure. I love that you're bringing this up because I'm a living poster child for this exact philosophy. If you've watched the very first video that I put on this channel, I went through some really radical life changes having been really sick with this autoimmune disease and coming back to nature. And sure, yes, I'm using functional or medicinal mushrooms to control and, modulate my immune system. Absolutely. But mine was a holistic approach in that I changed the entire life. I dropped out of the rat race of the very busy, stressful music business that I was in for decades, right? I came back to this calm, peaceful place. I started growing a garden. I started hunting, fishing, and foraging all of my food. Yeah. I started living in a way that was reducing stress in probably in a much more efficient and strong and powerful way than the chaga fungus could ever do for me.
Yeah.
But it's one part of a bigger picture. And I love that you brought that up because it's so often missing in these discussions. Everyone in our society wants to pop a pill and have a magic cure. And that's not how nature works. That's not how our bodies work. And that's not how life works.
And it can be really challenging to hear. And people can be like, well, I can't make all these other changes. And I completely,
I get that. People are busy. The world is structured in a certain way, and we're all part of it. And we have to do our best with the variables that we have in front of us.
But it's the piece just to remember of like, yes, there can be these biological activity that's possible, but it's not always going to be the result from just like a product that you purchase.
100%. And I'm glad you said this too, because, I fall into that trap too of because I've had such good luck with the chaga fungus in my own health strategy. I don't think I've ever oversold it, but sometimes I'm very happy to let you know that I have people that contacted me from literally all over the world via my social media channels and stuff, and that come and take my classes and seminars and stuff, who have just these amazing stories of their positive interactions with the chaga fungus, specifically since we're talking about it today, and other elements in nature, plants and other functional mushrooms, etc. And I'm very happy to relay that stuff, but I don't ever want to oversell it. We started out this conversation by saying we want to debunk some stuff. So let's just make sure that, and I'm glad, I don't know if that was your way of reeling me in, because I get so excited about the use of this fungus, and it's changed my life, literally changed my life in such a positive way. I feel like I want to proselytize, but also there's some danger in that. Just because it's worked for me in the way that it has and it's had such an effect, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to for you unless you make other changes like Laura is saying.
Yeah. All of
I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Again, it's if we think about claims as someone who works with so many different organisms, it's and individuals, I always think, again, we can have all this research and all this stuff, and it's approaching them as their possibilities instead of claims. So these things are possible if the conditions are right.
And also, I think it's a good time to just sort of reiterate too, we are very much in the wild west of functional and medicinal mushrooms. The research that is, we kind of touched on this, but the research that so many people want to see, especially in vivo human clinical trials, may never come. Okay? And that's really, really important to know. Yeah. So you're using these compounds at your own risk, right? That's really important to note. And just before I forget, I want to mention, we're going to talk about some other conditions and stuff that you may be able to treat effectively with the chaga fungus. But I want to note, we talked about this earlier before we started the video, about just some contraindications and some areas, some health issues that you may be experiencing where you should avoid the chaga fungus. I think this is equally important to let people know, that it's not this panacea. We've kind of hit that. But there are some things based on the science that we have that we know definitively should where if you're suffering from any of these conditions, you should exclude the chaga fungus from your health strategy altogether. Some of those would be liver ailments where yours isn't functioning particularly well because of the oxalic acid and other acids contained in this fungus. Those can be very hard on your liver, and if yours isn't functioning well to start with, you would really be doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, there are some other mushrooms that might be better.
That might be better suited. Maybe you would head on over to wildmuskoka.com or
no, not these ones, but...
Oh, okay, sorry. But Laura is an herbalist, and she's very knowledgeable in that area. I also wanted to mention really quickly before it leaves my mind, if you're taking blood thinners or you have a blood disorder of some type, you should avoid the chaga fungus altogether. Or take it in very, very small doses. Maybe you should go talk to a registered herbalist before you ever even think about taking a cup of chaga, because you could exacerbate that condition. There's some recent research, although I'm a little skeptical on the science of it myself, but I want to mention it, that if you're diabetic, you should probably consume the chaga fungus with caution. Maybe you could speak to that one?
Yeah, it's mainly if you're taking diabetic medication that's stabilizing your blood sugar, that it can just, because it has a blood sugar stabilization action in itself.
It does, yeah.
It may just increase the efficacy of your medication. So you might then find yourself in like a hypoglycemic.
Yeah, it could go the other way. Yeah.
Yes. So it's like it's working now. Your medications are working too well. But for people that are potentially that maybe have been identified as pre-diabetic and are not actually on diabetic medications, then
still fine.
It might actually still be useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, these are the cautions these are under using high medicinal doses.
Yeah.
If you've been somewhere and someone gave you like 1 cup of chaga tea,
you're gonna be fine.
You're not gonna have like a contraindication with your medications.
Yeah.
It's really, these are the like very conservative recommendations
for prolonged use.
Prolonged use.
Absolutely.
But like the rare, you've been somewhere and you've had
a hot chocolate at the cafe, you're going to be fine.
It's fine. We're not talking about high contraindications with your medications, or it's like the longer medicine.
This is actually a really good time too, and this is something that I really like to double down on in all the courses that I teach about functional or medicinal mushrooms, is that if you are curious about using them, you should consult a registered herbalist
or a naturopathic doctor, and remembering that sometimes naturopathic doctors have more training in the contraindications, particularly as it pertains to people who are also using Western medicine.
Other medications.
Yeah.
And that's really important. So like you could get on Google right now and find a naturopathic doctor or a registered herbalist in your area, anywhere. Literally just find that and go talk to that person. They're probably going to know a lot more about contraindications and the way that it might affect your particular condition based on your specific circumstances than an actual medical doctor would be able to.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to say that, but it's just the truth.
Yep.
There are many medical doctors out there who don't know the first thing about these compounds and turn their noses up at them. And conversely, I get a lot coming to do my courses.
Yeah.
Because there's people, I think there's a lot of curiosity about these. There's a growing database of science on these compounds, and there are you wouldn't believe the number of doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and various other professionals in that medical space who come and do my classes every single year.
Same. So
there's like and you must have this experience as well. So there's certainly a mounting curiosity, and I think there's a number of medical professionals out there who are starting to do the work on their own because the institutions that form them don't cover this stuff. And that doesn't, and I want to put this out there too, that doesn't make your doctor a bad guy. Okay? It doesn't mean that they're trying to withhold these medicines from you, or that there's sitting in some smoky back-filled room saying, oh, we better not give people chaga.
They're just not
They're trained a certain way.
They're not trained in it.
That's all it is.
So typically it's like, we've outlined, and it's like, if you're on any type of pharmaceutical medication, it's always good to just like review any new substances that you're going to be taking.
Check in with a registered herbalist or a naturopathic doctor, and there's nothing but good can come from that little sit down.
Yep.
Okay, so that's probably as good a point as any now that we've covered some of the like nerdy science stuff and some of the health stuff, etc. I think we've covered that sufficiently, or you let me know if we've covered it sufficiently. If you have questions, drop them down in the comments, and maybe Laura and I can pop in there from time to time and answer any specific questions that you might have on those aspects of it. But what we haven't talked about quite yet is preparation and processing and uses, etc. So maybe we get into that.
And folks, that entire portion of our conversation about drying and processing and best practices and the many uses of the chaga fungus will continue next Thursday at 7 p.m. I want to thank you all for hanging out with Laura and I tonight, and I hope you learned a whole bunch of new stuff about the chaga fungus. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I want to strongly encourage you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next video in this series. And hey, if you're new here, go snoop around the channel a little bit. I just started it, and if you like educational videos about nature and the outdoors, I'm pretty sure there's another one in there just waiting for you. Cheers.